Pushkin. Here's a thing I did not know about weather forecasts until very recently. They basically all come from the government. Sure, you may have your favorite weather app, your favorite TV weather person, but their forecasts are almost entirely driven by data that's collected and analyzed by government agencies. And, it makes a certain kind of sense. Gathering the data you need to make a useful forecast has traditionally been a huge, expensive undertaking. And having a reliable forecast is really valuable for lots of people in lots of different settings. So it's good that the government does the work and makes forecasts freely available to everybody. But the government is the government, and we shouldn't expect it to tailor forecasts for different businesses or even to build forecasts that are really useful for people who live in other countries, in countries where the government can't afford to produce its own forecasts. Now, imagine what a private weather company could do. A company that relied not only on government data, but that went out and collected data on its own. A company that came up with forecasts that would not have been possible before. I'm Jacob Goldstein, and this is What's Your Problem?, the show where entrepreneurs and engineers talk about how they're going to change the world once they solve a few problems. My guest today is Shimon Elkabetz, co-founder and CEO of Tomorrow.io, a private company that plans to put a constellation of weather satellites into orbit in the next couple years. Shimon's problem? How do you build a private weather company from scratch?
We realized that from a geopolitical and cost-effective way and all kind of the only way to solve it is to go to space.
Shimon and his co-founders launched Tomorrow.io in 2016. The company hasn't launched its satellites yet, but it already provides weather-related advice for companies like JetBlue, Uber, and the NFL. Even before he thought of founding the company, weather was a big deal for Shimon. When he was in his 20s, he was an officer in the Israeli Air Force. Weather is obviously a huge deal for pilots, for planes, and Shimon was constantly on the phone with meteorologists.
The solution was, hey, let's talk to a meteorologist 3, 4, 5 times a day. Hey, what's going to happen here? What's going to happen there? And then I take the data, I analyze what it means for me, what it means for the organization. And I have to do it several times because the weather forecast is constantly changing. And I care about multiple locations and I care about multiple parameters. So that was a very archaic way of addressing challenges at scale.
Calling the meteorologist and deciding what each plane should do does not scale. So in that universe, you're not at scale yet.
Not scale, not efficient, not automatic. When there's a human in the loop, there will always be an error.
Did you make mistakes?
Of course, everyone makes mistakes. I made a few of them. I have colleagues that unfortunately lost their lives due to weather-related accidents. It was very unfortunate. It's just been there, but I didn't think I'm going to start a company around it.
Shimon moved to the U.S. to go to business school. And one day, a few of his friends, military veterans who, like Shimon, wanted to start a company, started talking about the weather.
And we started talking about past experiences. And everybody were like, oh, you also feel this way. Oh, you also experienced that. And when we started looking at it, we said, okay, there is something here. We need to start looking into this. And let's try and understand whether, how the technology, how forecast is being generated. Why is it limited in accuracy? Now let's look at how businesses make decisions. Do they do it in the same way we did it in the past, or is there a better way to do it? And what we found out led us to start a company.
Well, what did you find out that led you to start a company?
All right. That's where it's becoming interesting. So the first thing we found out is that climate change is here. That was in 2016. It wasn't cool to speak about climate change back then.
I think it was cool. I think it was cool to me in 2016.
Trust me, when I spoke to investors back at the time and you spoke about climate change, they were like, give me some SaaS solution. Don't talk to me about climate change now.
Okay, fair. SaaS is software as a service. Keep going.
So we understood that the problem of managing weather-related challenges is going to get bigger. Climate change equals weather events become more frequent and more volatile in any given year in every part of the world. Period. Okay. More hurricanes, more wildfires, more heat waves. Yeah. Doesn't really matter where you are. There is some extreme phenomenon that is going to happen more frequently.
Okay.
So that's one thing we learned. The second thing we learned is that the technology of forecasting weather, meaning what's responsible for the accuracy, is generated and dominated by government agencies.
Right.
And as folks who served in the government for many years, we understood that there must be a way to privatize and innovate faster. And just to give you an example, NASA for decades innovated and paved the way to space, right? But today you have SpaceX, who's augmenting the capability of NASA.
A private company doing what the government has done for decades, basically.
Yeah, maybe not inventing the rocket from scratch, but definitely taking all the decades of research and adjusting it to a commercial use case. And what we found out is that there is an opportunity to create a SpaceX of weather.
So SpaceX builds rockets. You want to build weather forecasts. How do you do that? What do you need to make a weather forecast?
You need three ingredients on a very high level. You need observations that describe, the atmospheric conditions in real time.
The temperature, the wind, what pressure. Yeah.
Then you have a good real-time description, right? The next thing you need is a model, an equation, a set of equations, physical models. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you take the observations and you assimilate them into a model. And then the last thing you need is a computing power on which you process the model. The output of the model is a weather forecast. And what we found out is that there is an industry of weather forecasting companies. Big brands, a blue logo, an orange logo.
AccuWeather, right? Yeah.
The point is that these guys are here since the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. They just repackaged the forecast that the government agency or the government agencies publish every day, every hour, whatever.
Okay. So I'll say, I know the weather forecast is like a classic thing to complain about. Oh, the weatherman said it would be sunny and we had a picnic and it rained. I do feel like weather forecasts are pretty good and clearly they've gotten better. Was there a particular weakness or failure or set of weaknesses or failures that you really thought you could improve when you set out to do this?
If I may ask, where do you live?
I live in New York. I live in New York City.
Okay, so you're privileged because...
I am privileged. I'll be the first to say.
I'm in Boston. I'm as privileged as you are. Most of the world doesn't have NOAA.
The U.S. government agency, the big rich country government agencies that do a pretty good job of forecasting the weather.
Exactly. And if you're a private company and you try to provide equally accurate forecast for the rest of the world, you're limited. You cannot provide it. So there is a global problem.
So one thing you want to do better is provide better forecasts for people, businesses who don't live in rich countries that have big fancy weather agencies like NOAA in the U.S.
Exactly. That's one thing. The second thing is that even within the U.S., the agency's main job is to save people's lives.
Okay.
It is not to optimize businesses.
Right? That also seems reasonable.
Absolutely.
That's what I want them to be optimized for.
Absolutely. We're on the same page here.
Yeah.
But with some scientific improvement, you can help businesses have better outcome, improve their top line, their bottom line, their safety, their efficiency. So there is a lot of room for improvement. The other element of it is that, remember that I said, it's one thing to handle the forecast. The second thing is that once you improve either on the observation, on the modeling, on the computing power, and you get to more accurate forecast, there is the other part of it, which is how you make decisions and how do you do it at scale.
Right.
So this is something that the government almost doesn't address at all.
Except maybe when you need to evacuate a city for a hurricane or something, right? Very rare circumstances.
Exactly. Now, I'll give an example. A lot of companies like utilities or airlines, they work in a very similar way to the way that I described in my military service.
Some guy calling some other guy on the phone and being like, what should we do?
You go to a meteorologist, you speak to that meteorologist or get a report of raw data, and then you have to do a full analysis of what it means and make a decision. It's not scalable. Or if I have thousands of trucks driving in the country, or if I have thousands of miles of railways track, or if I have many airplanes in the air and I care about hundreds of airports globally, it's very hard to rely on 5 or 10 even meteorologists on staff.
Right. I've heard you say that a mistake you made early on was optimizing for accuracy. And that's really interesting to me. And I want you to tell me what that means.
So at the beginning, we thought that if we just create a more accurate forecast, that's it.
Yeah.
It's done deal. We serve.
Because that's a hugely valuable thing, right? Even if you're a little bit more accurate, that's worth a ton of money to an airline or the NFL or any number of really big companies.
Yeah. But what we found out, but we learned that most of the businesses that are impacted by weather do not know what to do with a weather forecast or with a weather data. And they need the full loop, the translation to insights and decisions. And that's what helped us design our platform and the way we're operating today.
So nobody understands how to read a weather forecast, basically. How to think
from
about
a business perspective,
yeah. So you realize from that like providing these people with a better weather forecast isn't actually going to help them solve their problem because they're not experts in analyzing the meaning of a weather forecast.
Yeah.
I mean, you've named a lot of your clients publicly, right? I mean, whatever, Delta and JetBlue and Uber and the NFL. I guess the NFL isn't playing now. Like, what are you telling JetBlue today? Like, what do they want to know today?
So, it's almost summertime. In the summertime, as you know, in the biggest hubs like JFK or Boston Logan, you have disruptions related to lightning strikes.
Thunderstorms will
exactly.
They'll shut the airport down for hours and everything will be a total mess.
Exactly. So instead of someone looking at a model and whatever, we're just basically providing a weekly calendar that says expected disruptions between that time to that time. Here are the recommendations to do ABC, staff more people here, staff less people there. So we actually go into the operational recommendations as a result of the expected disruption, as a result of the weather forecast. Now, listen carefully to what I'm saying. It's as a result to the weather forecast. So if you're not relying on an accurate forecast, the business insight is useless. It's actually damaging. So there is no way to get around the need to improve the accuracy.
Specifically, what are you better at forecasting than anybody else right now?
Precipitation data. We provide global real-time and nowcasting data that is providing kind of like minute-by-minute forecast for a range of about 6 hours on every point on Earth, which is quite useful. For example, you have some 60 minutes, minute-by-minute forecast that you have on some phones, but it's only in the US and in the UK.
Yes, I do find I have that on my phone and I find it's pretty good. Dark skies. I have dark skies on my phone and it's good. But you're saying if I left the US, if I went on vacation to Mexico or something, it just wouldn't work.
It's not available.
It's not available.
It's just not available. And we created this thing on a global scale with longer time horizon. That's one example. The other example is like wind. We forecast wind in higher accuracy for the next day, 2 days, 3 days, which is very useful for farms and things. So,
and are you just better at that because you're more focused on it and you've trained the models more than, and it's more important to your clients than it is to, say, a government agency? So you have an incentive to figure it out.
Yeah, exactly that. I'm sure that if Noah wanted to double down on that specifically,
Noah, the government agency,
they would have been able to do that, but they have no incentive. And, the pace of making a decision in a large organization is just not enabling them to move fast enough.
The next problem Shimon and his colleagues are trying to solve: how do you predict the weather for people who live in countries that can't afford a big national weather service like NOAA? To do that, Tomorrow.io is going to go to space. That's the end of the ads. Now we're going back to the show. Tomorrow.io's next big project is putting a constellation of weather satellites into space. And there are two big questions I had about that. What problem will it solve? And what's it going to take to make it happen?
So the first thing I'll say, what motivated us to get to space? So the main motivation was, how do we optimize forecast and make it more accurate? And when we looked at, the blend between, we have observations, we have models, we found out that the lack of observations on a global scale are the main reason why we cannot improve weather forecasting significantly on a global scale.
So the problem wasn't the models, the problem wasn't the
Yeah.
computing power. The problem was just there's just not enough data. When you get outside of what? Outside of the US, Europe, Japan, basically, the data quality falls off?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the most important weather sensor that we identified, and I think is agreed on all the community from NOAA to NASA to others, is Doppler radar.
And Doppler radar, just to be clear, is it the one where you see a color? Like if it's raining really hard, it's red or something? That's Doppler.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, radars are looking high in the sky, and they help us know where is it raining in real time, how the cloud formation looks like. It gives you some kind of 3D description of the atmosphere, okay? Now, what we found out is that 5 billion people live outside of radar coverage.
5 billion.
You go south of the border to Mexico, all the way to southern South America, and basically you don't know where it's raining in real time. Same for Africa, India, and many other places.
That is surprising to me. Maybe I'm naive, but like, were you surprised when you learned that?
No, because I came from a place where it wasn't.
Oh, you didn't have it either. You didn't have it either.
Yeah, it was pretty broken most of the time.
And it's not a new technology, right? It's a decades old.
It's not a new technology, but the implication of not having it is huge. You cannot provide flood alerts. Pilots, when they fly, for example, to Cancun, they don't know the weather in the route. It's a huge problem for the economy. The next point is that the oceans and the seas are not covered with radars. And every time, for example, a hurricane is formed over the Atlantic, the US government is flying airplanes over the eye of the storm to scan it with a radar so we can send it back to the models and understand if it's going to be category 1, 2, or 3, when and where it's going to hit, and whether we should evacuate Miami or New Orleans. So rest assured, nobody's flying any airplane over a typhoon or a cyclone in the east. So this is a huge problem.
In Asia. They're not going out in Asia to get a really accurate forecast of where it's going to go. They can't afford to do that.
Yeah.
So, but you can do it from space? Is that where this is going?
So exactly. So we realized that from a geopolitical and cost-effective way and all kind of the only way to solve it is to go to space. The problem is that radars are pretty big. The world has one radar in space today. It is called the GPM. It's a program by NASA with collaboration of the Japanese agency. It's more than $1 billion program that created one radar in space, a very sophisticated one. We have one radar in space today. That radar cost about $1 billion, if not more. Okay. And it samples every point on Earth every 3 days. So it's not very useful for hurricane forecasting because imagine you just sample the hurricane.
Because the hurricane's moving too fast.
Yeah. Or general weather forecasting. So what we were trying to do was to say, how can we take this huge radar and minimize it so we can put many of them, but we are a small company. We don't have $1 billion. Right. How can we actually do it in a way that will be cost effective? And the goal is, of course, to monitor every point on Earth with a radar in almost real time. Because when you do that, you are going to improve weather forecasting dramatically. You're going to improve hurricane, cyclone, typhoons. You are going to be able to provide flood alerts for every point on Earth. And it will improve also climate science, because now climate scientists will have better understanding of what actually happened.
Yeah, no, I'm sold on why it would be useful. It seems like the hard thing is, how do you do it?
Exactly. So how do we do that? The first thing we did was to focus on the sensor. How can we build a sensor that will keep most, if not all, the characteristics of the radar we looked at? And how can we make it small enough so we can launch it on not a nano or micro satellite, but something smaller than, the stationary satellites, low orbit. And bottom line, we finished the development of the radar, and in a few months, we're going to launch the first satellite out of a constellation of about 30. And our constellation is going to have two types of sensors. One is the radar, the second is a microwave sounder. The combination of the two is going to provide a very good scientific result for every point on Earth.
You sound very confident. Like, are you at a point where you know it's going to work, or is it the kind of thing that you hope is going to work?
No, we know it's going to work. The question is, okay, will it take us more time? Will we fail in the first launch? Will we need to iterate between one launch to another? But it is feasible. It is working. It is.
And how much is it going to cost you to get roughly 30 satellites up and monitoring the weather?
Our early estimations, which so far, given the inflation, are still are still in the same ballpark. We're looking at around $100 million for the entire constellation.
So that's a big cost reduction. That's compared to, what did you say, $1 billion for an existing one that only does once every 3 days?
Yeah.
What are the things that might go wrong? I mean, it seems like a quite hard thing that you're trying to do. I feel like as you're describing it, it's like, oh yeah, now all we got to do is get these 30 satellites up into space and we're going to go. But I imagine it's still going to be quite hard and lots of things can go wrong.
Of course. So you want me to give you examples of things that can go wrong?
Yeah. What are you worried about?
Okay. The rocket can explode in launch.
Sure. Classic.
Second thing is that, we may have some communication malfunction. We may have some, when we build our satellites and the radars, we may have to wait for longer than expected for chips to arrive, or all kinds of ingredients.
Like supply chain
issues is something pretty big right now. So there are so many things that can happen. But
are you sure the thing you built is going to work? All the things you've described is like, oh yeah, the rocket could blow up. That's not really our fault. Or the chip won't come. That's not really our fault. Like, is it at the point where it's like, oh yes, this will definitely work? Is it like that? Or is it possible that, okay,
it's going to work. It's going to work. The question is it going to be more expensive than we thought? Is it going to take longer? And there might be, business implications on tomorrow, but it is going to work. It's not a question of science.
Business, like might you run out of money before you can get it going? When you say business
implications? It can happen. Everything can happen in that context. But this thing is working.
Spending $100 million to put a fleet of satellites into space it's still a lot for your business.
It is a lot. And the market is very bad. It's probably the toughest market in the last 20 years for tech companies.
The market for raising funding, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. The investors are not very happy to see businesses that waste money or spend money or invest money, depending on how you look at it, to build a solution. And it's definitely a challenge. And I just hope that, the investment community will keep supporting us.
We'll get to the lightning round in a minute. But before we do, I just want to say that what Shimon talked about in this episode is actually a really good example of a big idea that came up in an earlier episode of the show. It was the episode where I interviewed the founder of the company Rocket Lab. And I was going on about how making rockets and satellites cheaper was a big deal. And he made the point that the big breakthrough is not just that they're cheaper. It's that cheaper rockets and satellites enable people to do big new things that just did not get done before. And Shimon's plan, Tomorrow.io's plan, is a perfect example of that idea. Even a decade ago, it would have been prohibitively expensive. But today, it's possible to put a constellation of satellites into orbit to improve forecasts everywhere on the globe for a price that is affordable for a startup, as long as they can get a few more years of funding. We'll have the lightning round with Shimon in just a minute. Now let's get back to the show. Okay, I know you have to go soon, but let's do a quick lightning round. What is one piece of advice you'd give to someone trying to solve a hard problem?
Focus on the problem and not on a solution. The solution will be obsolete. There are many kinds of solutions, but if you're focused on the problem, you're going to objectively look at what's right, what's wrong, and you'll be able to ditch something that doesn't work and find out something that is better. Focus on the problem.
What do you prefer, really hot weather or really cold weather?
Hot.
Okay, hot. Could there really be a Sharknado, like in the movie Sharknado?
I don't know.
What's the most underrated weather hazard?
Most underrated? Heat wave.
Heat wave.
Lots of people die from heat wave annually, strokes, health issues, heart attacks. I actually testified in front of the Congress in the summer of 21 on this topic specifically.
Other than weather, what's a domain where people should use probabilistic thinking more?
Finance, for sure. I mean, how you manage your investments.
Although I feel like bad use of probabilistic thinking was a major problem in the run-up to the financial crisis of 2008. I don't know if you remember, but people kept saying, like, this is a 1 in 10,000 year move in whatever, race. Like, clearly it's not. Your model is wrong, right?
Yeah. I'm thinking more in a personal level, like a household. How can a household manage their risk and everything? I think they should think about all the scenarios, all the probabilities, and I think people don't do that enough.
So weather is like this classic way to make small talk, when you don't want to talk about work, right? So what do you talk about when you want to make small talk and don't want to talk about work?
Oh, football. I mean, soccer.
I guess that's the other classic, right? Sports.
Yeah. But I'm very passionate about it for real. I mean, we could talk about it for an hour.
Who's your team? What do you say? Who's your club?
My club is an Israeli team called Maccabi Haifa.
How's Maccabi Haifa doing?
They're doing well.
If everything goes well, what's a problem you'll be trying to solve in 5 years?
How to reduce carbon emission with our solution. That will be probably the next step and will be the most impactful thing we can do. I don't know, but we'll try.
Okay. Shimon Elkabetz is the co-founder and CEO of Tomorrow.io. Today's show was produced by Edith Russillo, edited by Robert Smith, and engineered by Amanda K. Wong. I'm Jacob Goldstein, and I'll be back next week with another episode of What's Your Problem?